Hello, this is Gary Garrett, and this is the first part of a series of videos on drawing various types of animals' heads and portraits. We are using the giraffe and the fawn as our models, but this information can be changed and molded to fit just about any animal. We will start out with the giraffe as our first model. If you are at the zoo and the creature is moving, you have to find various creative solutions to drawing your constantly moving subject. In this video, I'll show you many different techniques and methods on solving the problem of how to draw animals' portraits. The first way I'm showing you here is using a general shape, like a triangle. Now you can see I'm adding and subtracting from that triangle, but using that real basic shape gives me something to wrap my head around in organizing my drawing to achieve a better, simpler solution. Notice in the bigger drawing, I'm using the axis lines across the top planes of the head to locate the features and the forms to make sure that everything's symmetrical. Making sure that all the facial features are where they're supposed to be. But also remember, at this point, I'm not drawing them in. I'm just making simple notations to where they're going to be. One thing you might notice is that I'm bumping up that central axis over the top of the head to make sure that everything is right in proportion, and then measuring off the bottom of the head to make sure that to keep that shape integrity, that original triangle we were talking about. Now that I have the general form in place and everything's measured pretty well, I'm going to transition over and sort of punch in the features a little bit more and sort of reinforce the general look of it. So now at this point I want to take a step back and sort of diagram up what went into the decisions I made to get to this point, the general design decisions. So perhaps now you can see how the general shape and how the anatomy, that skull of the giraffe, used along with the design diagram can show you a really sort of organic approach to putting this together. So this is where you sort of intertwine the idea of the hard structure, the skeletal structure in the back of the skull, along with the soft tissue in the muzzle and the nose area. And using both that diagram, there's the axis lines, the vertical axis line in the front, and then the horizontal ones going across the ears, helps you kind of keep the design pulled together. The blue lines are generally showing you what the planar structure is. So again, that's going to be really important when you put a light source on this, or even putting the markings on, spots on later. Locating where the eye is, and you can see where the skull kind of fits around that, and soft eye tissue rolls over the top of that. And again, what is going to end up being very soft muzzle, but at this point it has a very planar, hard edge to it. So at this point I'm going into the ears and making sure that the smaller stems of the ears fit into the skull, again sort of like a pipe into a socket. That way it'll reinforce all the overlappings and the spatial concerns, also make your animal look more realistic. Now I'm in a place in the drawing where I'm feeling a lot more comfortable and a lot more confident about where the forms are going. So now I'm going to come in and start to reinforce more of the soft tissue around the eyes, down in the mouth, still using the structure in the lower diagram, but now start to bring more of a roundness to some areas. But then, like I'm doing right now, coming in and adding the skeleton, the zygomatic arch, to make sure that the planes and the markings will be correct later. So at this place I'm going to come in and I'm going to start to reinforce the anatomical information. Sort of half between the muscle and the bone, but I'm hitting the lines a little hard so you can see where this will show up later in the drawing. Because remember, most of the time you're going to be using these landmarks out in the field and you won't be able to draw them this hard, or shouldn't draw them this hard on the actual animal that you're going to be looking at, but they're really going to help you organize the information later. So it's good to remember at this point that I'm hitting these lines really hard so you'll be able to see them in the diagram. You can also see perhaps where the forms are overlapping other forms, like the muzzle overlaps where the nose is, and the nose fits into the jaw, and then you go up to where the eyes are, and you can actually see the little keystone where the cartilage goes up, the bone goes up, and goes into in between the ears, and then forms up, curves, and then you can literally see the horns turning the corner and fitting in to those sockets at the top. So I'm about to move into the nose, and as you go in there, you'll be able to see how those axis lines across the top of the plane of the head really help organize the information so it doesn't end up being off symmetrical and looking strange. It's like you can see those lines and those overlaps, and then when I finally go into sculpting out and cupping out the front of the nasal area into the lips, the upper part of the mouth, will be really valuable in keeping that organized. So if you look at the photograph to the lower left, you'll be able to see all that soft tissue underneath the nose and underneath the idea of the jaw. That's what I'm moving into right now, and you may be able to see that I'm not putting an awful lot of curving lines in there, but I'm trying to keep the idea of the soft tissue, but at the same time not make it look sloppy, which a lot of big curves would do. So as I move up into the eye, you'll be able to see in that diagram in the lower left how I treat it as a ball, and then I put the lids as like forms going over the top. That allows for a much more rounded, volumetric form rather than a flat object, and it has more personality as well. So at this point I'm going back to the original drawing. And using the photographic evidence here, what I'm doing is I'm drawing more of the soft tissue, going in and sort of wireframing the face out, getting ready to put the spots on, get the markings on, even the fur patterns on. Now you can see I'm using the red pencil to really go in and deal with much more of the soft tissue, like cartilage around the nose, skin around the nose, and again using more of diffused line. And notice how it went from that very, very angular structural beginning to now adding and subtracting like more individual pieces of the personality. Now my design's becoming a little bit more finished, a little bit more solid. I'm going to add things like the windpipe to connect the head in with the bottom of the neck, really important, go around the eyes, add the upper lid. So now it's a combination between the skeletal forms and the soft tissue like the eyelids and the actual eyeball, but I'm still leaving the planes because I know I'm going to be putting lights and darks and shadow on this later. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to be moving in and using a darker pencil. Just those first sort of primary attempts at adding the important little sections, important little planes that I'm going to be adding lights and darks, texture, markings, various other unique qualities later. One of the important aspects with this demo is the fact that the structure and this methodology I'm teaching you can change and be morphed into several different solutions depending on the animal. What we have to the left is a Giraffes, which in structure is similar but very different from a giraffe. And you can see the streamlining of the forms in the diagram to the lower left, but at the same time it has the same basic qualities that we're working with in this giraffe. Just the proportions have changed. Now I think I have a good handle on this. What I'm doing is starting to add a little bit of the shadow pattern, just hinting at the light, so again I can get the rhythm of the movement of the cross-hatching and shading that I'm going to be putting in. So though I'm not going to be showing a back view of this giraffe, I'm going to show you the back of this Giraffes in front with the horns attached and the ears, just so you can get a basic idea of, again, how those forms plug into the skull, and using that ball, especially in the back view, as a basic form to get started with. Perhaps you'll notice whether it's the front view or the back view, you can see the way that those horns plug into the form and the way the ears insert into the back of the skull, and using those axis lines again as an organizing principle. Again, this information is to be taken out to the field. This is the idea that you have these landmarks and you have these processes for you to take this information out into the field and see it very sculpturally. So as your model moves, it won't give you any problems. You'll be able to take these various methodologies, take them out into the field, and be able to take that form and change it in any direction that you need. You become a real good problem solver in relationship to your drawing. Also, you become more confident in your drawing abilities That way, as problems arise, you'll be able to just sort of move through using these various methodologies to help you along. So now we've moved back to our subject, our photo reference. You can see now I'm starting to put some hair patterns in, some texture on top of our model here. And you might notice that what I'm doing is I'm picking sort of the edges of the planes and maybe a little bit more denser forms where they turn corners, like where they go around form, to sort of hit on first to find a rhythm of that shading, a rhythm of that texture. Even this far in the drawing, I'm not overly concerned about textures and details. I'm more about organizing the entire image so it holds together really well. So now I move back into the tracing paper overlay to show you the wireframing, the cross contouring of the animal, setting up where the spots are going to be. Now this is going to be extremely important because you have to make sure that those spots, those markings on the animal, whatever animal it is, identify the form, help move the sculptural idea of the creature along rather than just becoming sort of generic markings. What you may notice is that the slivers at the edge of the forms are getting smaller. The markings and the spots are going to become thinner as they move around the corner to show the idea of depth and visual movement. So now I move to sort of fill in those little squares. And if you may notice that I do it very quickly and just very sort of routinely. I'm not trying to sort of copy what I'm seeing in the photograph. It's more the process, leaving little bits of white in between that so you have little gaps there. Also, to understand this methodology, it allows you to take many spots like you see on the photograph to the left and simplify them back into the structure. So it'll make more sense in the way of the narrative rather than just drawing a bunch of aimless little dots all over it. So now I'm moving back and forth over the forms, just checking out the decisions I made, going up and throwing in the tufts of hair on the top. If you notice, even the tufts of hair on the top of the horns operate exactly like you're drawing a ball. And if you notice, those little tufts of hair still go with the cross contour over the top of that ball on the top of the horns. So now, using my knowledge of the form and photographic reference, what I'm going to do now is deal with surface textures. In a sense, bringing you to an end result and showing you the rhythm of the lines, the rhythm of the marks, the density of the lights and the darks, and again, modulating it all, not taking one section too heavily, but making sure that I see the way that the parts and even the little markings refer to the entire image. Perhaps now that I'm putting in the markings on the cheek, you'll notice how those forms go cross contour and go with the wireframing that I had in the diagram that I made earlier. You also may notice that I don't spend a lot of time in one particular area, that I'm sort of bouncing all over the image to make sure that, again, it's unified, that I have a bigger sense of how all the forms fit together and how the shading and light logic goes with my subject, rather than getting involved with needless details that will obscure the final image. We're arriving at sort of the finish or the completion of this. One thing you may notice is that my cross contour marks, the sort of cross hatching marks, vary in direction and in angle and intensity, but I still try to pick a rhythm up so your eye moves through and over the top of the forms. This will be like one of the things that's really going to make your drawing have a nice textural level to it, nice completion. So as we finish with this drawing, we're going to move on to some field sketches that I've made at various zoos and wildlife refuges. And you can see that when you do this, it's drawn from different angles. Don't just settle on one, and also make sure that there's necks and bodies that go with them. At this point we're dealing with the heads, but you can see that there's more than just one single way to do this. Also, this doesn't just apply to giraffes. You can use this on a wide variety of different antelope and creatures of this sort of head structure. So for our next model, we're going to be using a fawn. It's a young baby deer here. And generally, again, laying in the structure, using the same technique as before, and then making some slight differences and changes in the size of the muzzle, the area and location of the eyes. The size of the muzzle is much more square than the giraffe is. And of course, the ears for the size of the head are much larger. Now, if I was drawing this out in the wild or at a zoo, I'd make sure that, again, I use that ball as my beginning, and then come in and use those axis lines across the ears to make sure that I got the proportions right. Then come in, make sure that, again, the sizes and location, and then go in and sort of start to cut a little bit more of the individual aspects of the creature out. Right now I'm using that little muffin or that little mushroom, cut mushroom, sliced mushroom at the tip of the nose to kind of give me where the stopping point is there. And using those axis lines to check out where the eyes are and drawing that line that goes from the nose, the ears, through the eyes to keep everything in line and proportional. Now the blue line is where the landmarks are, where the forms sort of show to the surface a little bit more. It's also going to be where the skin texture or the fur texture will be. Basically, where I'll be turning that form in space. So here's some reference of an adult deer, photograph and a diagram showing the skull structure underneath and where everything fits in. Now you can see how I'm taking this young fawn with this more rounded form. You can see the older it gets, the more square and more streamlined the head gets. Make sure you kind of keep this in mind and use that skull, use that anatomy as a starting point for your proportions and for your structure. So now I'm moving more quickly around the form again to check my proportions, check the locations, proportions of the features and such, and now come in and give it a little bit more personality with the whites of the eyes, sort of start to cut into the muzzle a little bit more. And again, overall check my overall composition, my overall proportions of the figure so it's believable. Now we're at the point where I can do this tracing paper overlay and sort of show you the structure where it kind of came from. I couldn't really show this while we were doing it because it would overwhelm the drawing. Now we have the drawing and the photographic reference so you can see the thinking behind it. And perhaps those axis lines, the verticals and the horizontals, that center line and then a line across the eyes, over the top of the muzzle, down into the nose, and especially out into the ears to make sure, again, everything works in concert. And then on the upper left, you can see it switched over. Now there's a diagram of a Gurnuck head. And you can see how very similar it is, but how different it is. Like Gurnuck's, the muzzle's longer. This fawn, the nose is wider and shorter. So this is one thing you're going to do out in the field, is you're going to start to look for these characteristics to unfold and make sure that you make notation of them. At this point I wanted to bring in some field sketches, diagrams to the left of deer and then that one antelope up in the upper left hand corner. And you can see that again I'm taking everything and sort of reducing it to the common denominator to make sure that it works. I think the drawings have sort of a clinical look to them, but at the same time they're very useful because they're not supposed to be like magnificent rendered out drawings. Now moving back to the photo reference and finishing off our deer here, giving it a little bit more surface tension, a little bit more texture, certainly personality in the eyes, even with the whites of the eyes coming off of it. It's sort of going a little backwards. I shouldn't be drawing the eyes first, but they're very enticing, so I'm going to do them because I know how to fold them back into the rest of the drawing. Perhaps you'll notice as I go in and start to do a little bit more of the surface design, surface texture on this, is that I'm a little bit more aggressive on this fawn than I was on the giraffe. It's because the fur is a little bit darker. It's a little easier to see and has more of a visual impact. You can see all the lines that I'm doing. It's like I'm not just drawing one line, I'm drawing rhythmic lines that all sort of connect to one another. And even the secondary levels of line where I'm overlapping stuff, they all flow in the same direction. This keeps the head from breaking into pieces. Again, you're thinking of an entire image rather than little individual properties. So you don't want the eyes to come apart. You don't want the nose to sort of break off. You don't want the hair to overdo it. You want all these little elements to work together in concert. So now we're at the point where I'm almost finished. So I'm coming in here and putting those last little strokes to kind of pull everything together, especially in here where the corner of the eye and the muzzle meet. Give it a little bit more of a darker accent so it pulls out the form a little bit more. Now these are some drawings I did at the zoo. These are gurnocks and very similar in structure to the deer. And that's a male on top and a female and a baby. And using this technique, you can be very, very flexible in your approach. These are llamas and not the same as a deer, but you can see the same structure. If you practice this, you'll become very successful in moving from one creature to another. Thank you very much for watching the video, and hopefully you'll watch the other ones in the future. Thank you. Bye.